So we begin, even 4 minutes ahead of schedule. Praise God. With a broad sort of overview, thank you, of the Jewish rituals around end of life, both before death and after death, grief and mourning. And so this might feel a bit like a whirlwind. We're gonna each, the rabbis, the clergy, you're gonna take a few minutes each to go over step by step Jewish death and dying, and then we will have more time after this session to go into more depth, ask deep questions, and really process and integrate the information that we are about to just begin soaking up in this moment. So with that, I want to invite Rabbi Craig Axler from Temple Isaiah, Rabbi Jenni Greenspan from Beth Shalom, and David Zinner, expert in the field, former director of Kavod V'Nichum, and I'm proud that he is also a member of Columbia Jewish Congregation. Please come on up to the bima. And we begin with Rabbi Linda Joseph.
We're going to begin our exploration of death and dying, this difficult mitzvah, with the process that happens for some people leading up to dying. And that is illness, sickness. And when somebody is ill or sick in Judaism, we say what we call a mishaberach. And we say a mishaberach for those who are ill, those who've had accidents, and the assumption that we make until it's very clear that there is no chance of living, the assumption we always make is that there is hope for healing of body and for healing of spirit. Physical cure, refuat haguf, is the healing of body, and the healing of spirit is a spiritual healing, refuat hanefesh. And even if the body can't recover, we do hope for some sort of wholeness as people make this final journey. Traditionally, the Mishaberach prayer belongs in the synagogue, and it's said when the Torah is read. Usually, in the traditional context, a close relative or friend is called to the Torah for an aliyah, and sometimes the person who is ill, if they are able. And a Mishaberach, one who blesses prayer, is offered for them using their Hebrew name and that of their parents. Increasingly, in this last millennia, the end of the last millennia and into this century, so late 20th century, early 21st, the custom has arisen in congregations to offer a communal mishaberach, a general mishaberach. It was popularized by the writing of a melody by Debbie Friedman, and many of you may be familiar with her beautiful mishaberach, and introduced into congregational worship. And Debbie Friedman's mishaberach, her creative mishaberach, has spurned many other gorgeous melodies, healing melodies that are sometimes also used in services. Also, the custom has arisen in the late 20th century and this first half of this 21st century for mishaberachs to be done by chaplains or doctors or nurses or social workers or clergy or family members and friends for those that might be ill, undergoing surgery, treatments, admission, even after they've been discharged. So we have really expanded upon this concept of mishaberach in the last 40, 50 years. The traditional prayer of the Mishaberach is as follows, and I'm going to use gender-neutral pronouns so that it will be inclusive of all. May the one who blessed our ancestors, patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, matriarchs Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal the one that is ill, and then we have the person's name, child of, and their parent's name. Some people just use the mother's name. Some people will use both parents' names. May the Holy One overflow with compassion upon them, to restore them, to heal them, to strengthen them, to enliven them. The One will send them speedily a complete healing, healing of the soul and healing of the body, along with all who are ill, among the people of Israel and all humankind, soon, speedily, without delay, and let us say, Amen. Greg.
So when this day of learning was conceived of and started with this panel going through the various elements of kind of life cycle around death, as it were, I asked for the honor of talking about vidui. And in part because vidui, the confessional prayer before death, had an outsized impact on my own path to becoming a rabbi long before I ever knew that I was going to become a rabbi. I would say kind of it's the origin of my own call, though I let call waiting ring for a while. When I first encountered vidui outside of the Jewish community even, in my work in music therapy. That's a completely different story for another time. But what I'll say is this. In the years since that time, many of the most impactful and important experiences I've had as a human being and as a rabbi have centered around that time immediately before death, when, as opposed to the time of Misha Berach, we know that the hoped-for outcome, the prayed-for outcome, is no longer healing, and it is no longer life. It is for the transition and the ease into death. And much like Misha Berach before Debbie Friedman's melody, I would say that vidui as a practice in the liberal branches of Judaism has less awareness and less, impact and use than it ought to. And one of the reasons why I would say is because, number one, it doesn't have a melody, although somebody could write a vidui melody, I guess. So. And maybe Debbie Friedman didn't write a vidui. That must be why. But I really think it's actually because of the title of this day, a difficult mitzvah, that many people are very scared of that moment when their loved one or they themselves are anticipating death in a very real and very near-term fashion. Vidui as a word is familiar more so to people who just sat in Yom Kippur services or maybe who sit in more traditional services as the confessional prayers. And anytime I speak to Jews about we're going to say a confessional prayer, they'll say, Father, I'm really okay. But the truth is, a confession at the end of life is very much an authentically and inherently Jewish practice. The confession itself is different than our confessions of Yom Kippur and of the High Holy Days and in some traditional circles in other prayers as well, where we confess our sins, as it were, and try to make our way past them. In the vidui before death, various different formulations of it exist, and they vary by denomination and they vary by community. But what I always say they all kind of aim to say is this: I acknowledge before you, my Creator, that I have not lived a perfect life, that I have done things that were wrong. And if I have done something to anyone, whether I was aware of it or I was not, I pray that my death becomes an atonement for that act. Freeze there for a moment. The idea of death as an atonement. The idea that perhaps there was something I did and I never even got to know about the feelings that I hurt or the pain that I caused in this world. And I'm praying, God, that I could die with a clean slate. Somehow, cosmically, you would make that the case for me. And maybe, just maybe, there are actually things that I'm fully aware of that I ought to have said sorry for, and I haven't gotten the chance, and I never will. That's component one of vidui. I was not perfect. Please let me be forgiven. Section number 2 of vidui. I recognize that there are those who have harmed me and hurt me, sometimes in ways that they realized, sometimes in ways that they didn't. Some have come to me and asked for forgiveness, and maybe I didn't even give it to them, and some maybe aren't even aware that they hurt me. I hereby release and forgive anyone who's ever hurt me. Again, the idea of dying with a clean slate, of the ability to transition from this life not holding on to anger and resentment, and releasing it. I wasn't perfect, and the world wasn't perfect to me. Section number 3. God, please take care of my loved ones when I'm no longer here to do so. You are the one who cares for orphans and widows in the traditional language of vidui. You are the one who takes care of those who have no one to protect them. Please be there for my loved ones and grant them comfort. Section number 3. Typically, vidui might end, typically does end, with the recitation of the words of Shema Yisrael. And we think about the notion that Shema is really among the very first prayers, if not the very first prayer that we teach a young Jewish child. And we hope and we pray that perhaps that affirmation of faith and oneness with God and with a peoplehood would be the last words of prayer that we give off of our lips. And that would be wonderful. And so ultimately, vidui comes as a complex prayer. It's not short. It's not just a couple of words. And more often than not, in my own personal practice and what I've experienced, the individual who's about to transition out of life is not in the state to say this prayer. If they're conscious, and that's a whole different question for other presenters, if they're conscious at all as they're transitioning out of life, perhaps they're not able to say the prayer. And so traditional practice and modern practice of vidui is that it's a prayer that can be said on behalf of someone. And when I visit someone in the hospital or in hospice or at home and they are truly transitioning, whether they are verbally responding, whether their eyes are open or not, whether they have not done either of those things for days, I always speak to them and ask for permission to say this on their behalf. And perhaps they'll respond, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, and I take that as a response as well. I also empower family members. You can say this prayer for your loved one. I'm saying this prayer as your clergy member, as your rabbi, as your friend coming to help in this transitional moment. I'm saying this prayer on their behalf, but you can say this prayer on their behalf as well. And so sometimes I'll leave a copy of that prayer with the individuals who are then left sitting for what might be minutes, hours, days, weeks, maybe months afterwards. And that's another key piece about the vidui. I try to emphasize this, especially to individuals who themselves are dying and to their loved ones who are necessarily probably afraid. I don't believe that the vidui prayer magically does anything. I legitimately do not believe that one says vidui and then God hears above. This is my own theology, by the way. If you believe this, nothing wrong with that. That God hears above and says, time to take this soul. I have had the experience of leading vidui and having had that exactly happen, which maybe challenges my own assumption on this. But for the most part, I'll say that you could say vidui, and then you could say vidui again, and then we might say vidui again next week. And it's just covering the bases, as it were, or bringing that comfort and that encouragement that we are perhaps transitioning out of this life with that clean slate. It is a beautiful practice. It is one that I wish more people within the Jewish community would know about and have at their fingertips in just the right moment, or would invite in their Klei Kodesh, their clergy, to come and to experience this together. And it is something that I know I will have the privilege of leading with others all the way through to the time when I'm hopeful to say the words myself, or to have somebody gently and tenderly come and say them for me. So just a little bit about vidui. And next is coming.
It's great to learn, and I loved hearing about the vidui. I'm David Zinner. Throughout Jewish history, there have been associations, people who gather to form synagogues, people who gather to pray on Tuesday mornings. But there's only one special association that has the name Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society. And those are the people who take that mitzvah upon themselves to care for people after they die and take care of them as representatives of the community. And what are the two things that this society does? It focuses on Tahara and Shmirah. Although traditionally it did much more. If you go back to 1564, for example, and look at what happened in Prague, the Chevra Kadisha took care of the cemetery. They would do the vidui with the person who was dying. They would do that whole continuum of care at the end of life. But it wasn't until about 1626, about 400 years ago, that the rituals that we do where the Chevra Kadisha were codified. It was written up in a book called Ma'avar Yabok by Rabbi Aaron Berachia, and almost impossible to read. It's very spiritual, very Kabbalistic, but we've taken out of it some of the prayers that we use when we do a tahara, and we're able to, most groups that do taharas do that similar form of prayer. So I'm going to talk about tahara a little bit because that's one piece, and I'm going to talk about shmirah a little bit too. So what is a tahara? Some people think a tahara is when you wash the body of a person who died. But that's not exactly what it is, okay? Tahara has 4 different elements to it. One of those is that people from the community come together and they represent the community. So they're not doing this on their own. They're not doing this for themselves. They're doing this as representatives of the community. A second element that happens is there's a whole liturgy. There's a whole set of prayers that they do. And the prayers talk about, for example, one of the opening prayers is asking God for the strength to do this mitzvah, to care for the body of the person who died. Another one is asking God to have mercy on the person who died. So there's a whole series of prayers that come from other parts of our liturgy that are put together in a whole sort of seamless package. A third part of the Tahara ritual is the kavanah, the intention that people bring to it. Without the kavanah, you can't really do a Tahara. You can't do it carelessly, you can't do it lackadaisically, you can't do it while you're thinking about the baseball game that you're missing or anything like that. You have to have some kind of focus. And the fourth part of it is the physical actions. So a tahara is much more than washing and dressing a body after a person has died. It involves all those 4 elements. And shmirah, which sort of is the companion to tahara, is the ritual guarding of the person when they die. Right? And that traditionally is done from the time when the person dies until the time when they're buried. It can vary from community to community how it's done. Some communities don't do it at all. Some do it very well. Some do it with volunteers from their own community. Some combine paid people and volunteers. But it's really an interesting mitzvah, and especially during COVID, it really became challenging because we weren't able to go into funeral homes and do this because, we didn't know how COVID was transmitted, so we were trying to be safe. So this thing evolved, which we called virtual shmirah, right? Where maybe you weren't in the presence of the body at all, right? Maybe you were doing it from home and you just had the person in your thoughts. And when you do shmirah, you traditionally do psalms, but you do other readings that are in keeping with that also. So it's sort of an interesting concept that COVID has sort of forced us to, I hesitate to say think out of the box, but we've had to come up with some innovations and really think through what was the original intent of this. The original intent of Shmirah was to physically guard the body from body snatchers and rodents and things like that, but now it's more of a spiritual guarding. And maybe you don't have to be physically present to be a spiritual guard of someone. So we've also had to innovate when we come to taharas because we weren't going to the funeral home to do taharas. So we've innovated there too. We did something called the spiritual tahara, which people are calling tahara ruchanit, where a group gets together on Zoom and they do the same prayers and they do the same kavanah, but they can't really physically wash the body. And sometimes a funeral director in a funeral home would do the physical actions for them while they all did the prayers and everything else. So we've been forced to come up with some interesting innovations during COVID, but the spiritual aspect of it is the important aspect of it. And, a lot of folks say, well, I can't do that. I don't want to be around a dead body, that's yucky, that's icky, that's scary. And for some people it is, especially your first time. But if you think about what you're doing, if you think about how important this is to the family, knowing that someone from their community was caring for their loved one, that these are the last people to see them because we usually keep the casket closed during the funeral, and think about the care that they exercise and how they treat the person, and they give them their final bath, just like when a newborn gets their first bath, this is their final bath, and dress them and put them in the casket, and it's all done with loving kindness, right? It's all done with incredible respect, and when you're done doing this, what's really interesting is how the people who do the tahara are changed, right? It's one thing to say, we're doing a tahara to help this person get to the next level, to go before God in judgment, right? It's another thing to say, when you do that for them, you become a different person too, right? You are no longer the same because you know now the difference between alive and dead, right? Before it's sort of like, you watch TV and somebody dies, or a movie and the actor comes back the next time in the next movie, right? Or kids play video games and they press reset and all the characters come back to life, right? This is reality, right? You can't deny that this person is dead. You lift up their arm and you know what's going to happen? It's going to fall down, right? They're not going to hold their arm up. And when you dress the body of a person who's dead, it impresses upon you how precious life is, how you have to treat everyone with respect because life is so unique, so critical. And when you learn that lesson by doing this work, you become a different person. So I look forward to seeing you all in the workshop.
One of our breakout groups after this session is going to be learning about Chevra Kadisha and how you can get involved, and also a little bit more about that process. So your loved one has died. Some of us have been there. Many of us have been there. And you don't immediately enter the period of Jewish mourning. There is a period between death and burial that is called aninut. It's the in-between moment when you're not yet a mourner, yet still you're going to observe some of the traditions of mourning. This period of aninut is a very practical period, because in the few days, and traditionally in Judaism we bury as quickly as possible, in the few days between death and burial, there are many arrangements that need to be made. And many of you have been there. There are people to notify. There's the visit to the funeral home, and sometimes the arrangements have been made, and sometimes you have to make the arrangements even though you're in shock from the death. There is the house to be prepared for the funeral. There's just a lot of stuff to do. So Jewish tradition says that we are actually exempt from many mitzvot. We don't have to lay tefillin if we're tefillin layers. We don't have to say the Shema if we say the Shema. We don't have to go to services because we're busy putting together and preparing ourselves for the time that we are going to be in full mourning. It's also traditional that we do not comfort the mourners during this period, prior to burial. So it's not the time to say Kaddish many people will have their aunt or uncle die on a Friday and they say, Rabbi, can I say Kaddish? And I'll say, has the funeral happened yet? And they'll say, no. And I said, not yet. Soon, but not yet. When the funeral happens, then we can say Kaddish. But right now we're in Anenut. We're between being mourners. We're sort of mourners, but we're between being full mourners. We're dealing with the practical. We're dealing with the practical. It says in Pirkei Avot, do not console a person whose deceased relative is before them. And that's the origin of not saying Kaddish, not calling up and consoling someone. You can call someone up and say, can I help you? But it's not the time to console someone. It's also not the time to view or visit a body. In Jewish tradition, we don't console the deceased relative prior, right? We make the actual arrangements. It's not yet about being in mourning. Now, how is this period like being a mourner? Well, when one hears the news that one's immediate loved one has died, and there are 7 relationships that are immediate loved ones that traditionally put you in the mourner category. That doesn't mean you can't mourn for somebody if you're outside of that category, but it traditionally puts you in the mourner category. That would be mother and father, parents, brothers and sisters, siblings, spouse, and children, right? That would put you in the immediate mourning circle. When you hear the news that one of your immediate relatives have died, it's traditional to rent one's clothes. Today we often, some people will tear a black ribbon at the funeral, but it's traditional actually on hearing the news that you rent your clothes. Also, you rent it again at the beginning, and we'll talk about this in a minute, at the beginning of the funeral. So in that way you show that your heart is torn upon hearing the news, but then you get busy and you make all of the arrangements that need to be made. Now, this period of anenut, it doesn't go on forever, right? 1, 2, maybe if you've got people traveling 3-4 days. And then at the time of burial, that is when you flip over into full mourning.
We're noticing a theme of transitions. A transition from wellness to illness and to death, and then a transition of the body from a body that once was living to a body that is to be buried, that we care for the body and we care for the soul. And so now I'll talk a bit about what we often think of as the Jewish funeral, which actually has a lot of different concepts to cover, beginning with the anenut process that Rabbi Joseph was just speaking to us about, with kri'ah, with the tearing. Traditionally, at the tearing, it's a biblical sign of mourning, a biblical sign that our very soul is torn at this loss. Most notably in our Tanakh, in the Torah, we have Jacob rending his clothes when he hears when he believes he is hearing of the death of his son Joseph. And so today we often use these little ribbons that can be pinned to our clothing, traditionally for a parent directly over your heart, and for one of those other relationships on the right-hand side, both signs of tearing. And the reason I also bring this kri'ah, this tearing up, is that for some, it can begin in the moment that you realize that you have become an onain, a person in anenut that we just learned of. And for others, we do it at the very beginning of the funeral process, when we prepare to bury our loved one's body, and we prepare to now shift from the transitions for the person who has died to the transitions that the person who is left behind is going through, as they shift from being an onain to being an avel, someone in mourning, in avelut. So they start with the kriya, with a blessing that's Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam Dayan HaEmet. Blessed are you, God, judge of truth. To me, this has always meant in that moment when we are least sure of what's right, in that moment of shock at loss, we just turn to God to know the truth. Even if we can't quite feel it or discern it, don't think that this can be true or be right, we can turn over a moment in our brains to let that soul be taken care of, let our own souls be taken care of by God in this moment of pain as we have to face a new truth. And after we have this kriya process at the beginning of a funeral, we move into hesped, or eulogy, eulogizing, where we hold on to the memory of the person who we're preparing to mourn for, quite truthfully. And we actually saw the first example of hesped, the first eulogy, in the Torah reading that we read yesterday morning. In Parshat Chaye Sarah, the very second verse of the Torah portion, Vatamot Sarah, Bekiryat Arba, Hi Hebron, Be'eretz Canaan, Vayavo Avraham lisbod leSarah livchota. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is now Hebron in the land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to eulogize Sarah and to bewail her, to cry over her. The commentaries point out two things. Lisbod leSarah, to eulogize for Sarah. That this eulogy is Avraham, but it is honoring the person whose soul has left their body. It is honoring the person that we are remembering. That the eulogy is, in some ways, for the person who has passed. And yet we also have in the Talmud Sanhedrin, they point out that there's this little phrase, Vayavo Avraham. Avraham came. It seems that Avraham might not have actually been in Kiryat Arba when Sarah passed. So we waited. The funeral waited a moment for Avraham to come. And this is why when we have this tradition of burying as soon as we can, we also make sure that the people who most need to be there have the opportunity to get there. And that's why we see some in the land, in Eretz Yisrael even today, in the state of Israel even today, often funerals will happen the same day or the next day. And for many of us, and we're living in a much larger geographic land, can have it take a couple of days, because Vayavo Avraham, we sometimes need to let the person come. In this eulogy, we offer everything we can in praise of the person and the legacy that we want to hold on to, partially to honor them and partially for us to hold on to their legacy. And in this moment, we start to shift. Not only do we honor the person we've lost, but we take their story and the teachings that they gave us into our own hearts. And we use their name. By the way, this verse mentions Sarah's name twice, and so it's important when able to offer a eulogy, we use their name. Commentators also point out, we say that Avraham eulogized before he cried. Some of us would think, don't we cry when we first hear? How could he have eulogized before he cried? I think this says that we have permission to go through this process in the way that's best for us. That some of us need that closure moment of the eulogy before we can really let it in and to cry, and that this offers us a moment to let go of any guilt we might feel about not being able to cry right away. Because at our very, very first funeral in our religious history and ancestry, at the very first funeral of our first matriarch, even Avraham first did anenut, first did caring for the funeral, preparing for the funeral, and then let himself cry and give in. The commentators say, but don't you cry first? Then of course, if you cry first, both are legitimate forms of how we enter into this process. As part of the funeral, we first begin with the tearing, wearing the very badge of our broken souls. We honor the person that we've lost, and then we go into the actual burial process. First with the prayer El Malei Rachamim, which says, exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure to the soul of, put in the name, who has gone to his or her or their eternal home. Merciful one, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his or her or their soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he or she or they rest in peace. And we say, Amen. And then sometimes the two pieces of the funeral will take place in two separate locations, and sometimes we can do it all at the graveside. So this would be the pausing moment if the first piece of the funeral is done in a chapel or at the mortuary, and then we would go over to the graveyard and begin the actual lowering of the casket and the burial, where we do a concept called chesed shel emet, the truest chesed, the truest form of showing loving kindness, where we, all in attendance at the funeral, by the way, not just the immediate mourners, though starting with immediate mourners, begin the process of burying our loved one who's been placed into traditionally a very simple casket, fully wood, and we would begin putting in dirt into the grave. And sometimes that moment, sometimes my experience is often where the tears, where they have the eulogy and then the tears, often that moment is the one that really offers us that moment of release of so much pain and grief. And that's the moment that we shift from being onenim, people in anenut, to avlim, to mourners, as we bury and hear that awful sound of earth falling onto the casket, which we do, and it's called chesed shel emet, true loving kindness, because we know that the person for whom we do it can't do it for us. And so it's chesed and our last act that we can do for them. Traditionally, many will use the shovel, do the complete act for themselves. So they'll take the shovel and use and to gather the earth. Some even put it upside down so that the shovel is not used in a usual way, to show our hesitation. And each person will do at least 3 at a time, and then put the shovel fully down rather than passing it to the next person, so that we each in attendance at this funeral have the opportunity to offer this chesed shel emet. Once the casket is covered or the grave is filled, depending on your tradition, your rabbi, your funeral home, and your cemetery and their requirements, we shift to a special kaddish. We often think of the Kaddish, Rabbi Joseph talked about the Kaddish. Can you say Kaddish yet when you're in Onain? The Kaddish we often think of is the Kaddish Yatom, or the mourner's Kaddish, that we're used to hearing in services regularly. There's actually there's a special Kaddish that is said at the graveside, though some still use the mourner's Kaddish here because it's the words that most of us are most comfortable with, which adds an additional paragraph. And there's one other spot in our tradition that we use this version of the Kaddish. We use it when burying a person at a funeral, and we use it when we've finished a tractate of Talmud. If you've done a full study of an entire tractate of Talmud, the concluding form of Kaddish for that study is the same one we use as we conclude the memory and recognize we've closed the book on a person's lifetime, which I think seals back with the eulogy, with the hesped, seals back all of the lessons that we've studied by knowing that person, and all of the lessons that that person's legacy has had to offer us. In that moment, we treat the person's life almost as though it too is a piece of text to be revisited and learned from again and again, even if it can't be done in the same way anymore. And after that Kaddish, the people, those 7 relationships and the others there, but especially those 7 now shift from being onenim, being people in anenut, they're now into avelut, into mourning. At the funeral, sometimes we who are attending the funeral but are not actually immediate mourners will form 2 columns so that those who are now in mourning don't feel alone, and we each would say to them, Hamakom inachem etchem betoch sha'ar avlei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May God comfort you amongst all of the mourners of Zion and of Jerusalem. I think I'll end on this note. The thing that I find most profound about this sentence is that the name that we use for God in this moment, when someone has truly shifted into recognizing that they are now a mourner. The name that we use for God is Hamakom, which means literally the place. And so in this moment when we might feel like our own spirits are feeling a little bit up and lost and afloat, God now not only offers a truth that we can't quite sense, but offers us grounding and offers us a place as we enter Avelut, a period of mourning, as we become an Avel or an Avela, a mourner, and transition into Shiva.
So, after the funeral, after the burial, mourners return home to sit Shiva for 7 days. And Shiva comes from the Hebrew word for seven, or Sheva, because it is traditional to sit Shiva for 7 days. Though folks, while it's traditional, I think it's important to name there's the Jewish tradition, and then there are the choices that work best for our families and that feel best for those who are mourning in the moment. And so some families do decide to sit Shiva for less than 7 days, and some of us wish we could sit Shiva for many more than 7 days. But as both Rabbi Greenspan and Rabbi Joseph mentioned, there are 7 relatives for whom we are required to observe Shiva, and that is for a parent, for a child, so for a child and for a spouse. So we certainly sit Shiva for other relatives too. I recently sat Shiva for my beloved grandfather, but we are not considered required, and we are not considered immediate mourners, though we know that even when we're not considered immediate mourners, that doesn't mean that our heart breaks any less. And while we're sitting Shiva, it is customary to cover mirrors. And where does this come from? Certainly, the idea of covering mirrors may have a mystical significance to us, but we also cover mirrors as a reminder that it's not about us. It's not about how we look. Often, while we're mourning, there's the tradition of not shaving, not wearing makeup, not wearing jewelry. And so the idea of covering mirrors is connected also to this idea that we don't take the time to take care of our physical presence. We allow ourselves to be inward and to reflect on our inner self and not our outward appearances in this very acute time of mourning and sadness. And it's also custom when sitting Shiva for the immediate mourners to sit low. And I wonder if anyone has ever experienced this in a Shiva house. Yeah. So during the Shiva week, it's customary for mourners to remain home and to sit on low stools or a chair that's lower than others are sitting on. And this requirement is really intended, much like Kriya, where we have an embodied outward act that reflects the state of our soul in the moment. Also, when we sit low, it reflects our inner emotions as mourners. So in English, we say we're feeling low, right, as a way to say we're feeling sad or we're feeling depressed. So this is also in Jewish law a way to act out quite literally the way that we're feeling internally in the moment. And then, as I said, customarily, immediate mourners don't shave. We don't take luxurious baths. The rabbis say if you have to, you can take a shower, but make it quick. We don't traditionally wear leather shoes, so much like on Yom Kippur, because Jewish tradition regards leather as particularly comfortable, and there may also be other reasons, but that's the one I know. We're supposed to refrain from having sexual relations, and we're also to refrain from cleaning our clothes, again, as an outward sign that we're paying attention to our inward needs and our inward soul in the moment. And so during these 7 days of Shiva, our community gathers around us, and I think this Jewish technology is so deeply wise. The fact that when we're in our most acute mourning, the moment that we shift into Avelut, the moment when we shift into mourning, when we just feel like the world is maybe crumbling around us, we don't know which way is right or left, there's our community to catch us, to feed us, to hold us, so that we're not alone, and we know we're not alone. And so during Shiva, the Shiva house is hopefully, please God, a constant flow of community and loved ones, even people we might not know who show up to share with us this moment, this difficult moment. But then there's also the Shiva Minyan, and Shiva Minyanim happen every day. In observant homes, they happen 3 times a day. For some of us, they happen once a day. But that is a moment, at least once a day, when the mourners have the opportunity to say Kaddish amongst their community, their beloved friends and family. And we hope that there's a minyan. We hope that enough people are at the Shiva house, enough people show up, that we can form a minyan and our prayers can reach where they need to reach. So there are some rules about how to be at a Shiva house. And I think these rules are very wise because it's very easy. From my experience, it's very easy to walk into a Shiva house and want to just immediately comfort the mourner, assuming we know where they are, right, in the moment. But as we also know, most of us have been on the other side of mourning too, I expect. And we know that sometimes the way we're feeling, there's no rhyme or reason to it. And so it's hard to know what we're going to need in any given moment. So visitors are encouraged, according to Jewish tradition, to enter into a Shiva house quietly and to sit down near the mourner, but to say nothing and to let the mourner initiate the communication. And that's a way to make sure that we're meeting the mourner where the mourner is, right? And showing up for the mourner in the way that they need in the moment. And then, after 7 days, or for however long we're sitting Shiva, there's this beautiful tradition that the mourners leave the house. After 7 days of being inside, being in the home, right? We've left Anenut, where we're doing all the practical stuff that needs to be handled. We've entered Avelut, where we stay home. We stay grounded in our space. We let our community come to us. But when Shiva is over, the night that Shiva ends, the mourners walk outside with intention, around the block, around the neighborhood, as a way to slowly mark reemergence into the world of daily activities once again. We know the mourning doesn't end, but we also know we can't stay locked inside forever, even if we so much want to. And so we take a walk together around the block and slowly take one step in front of the other to reemerge. So even though Shiva has ended, one is still considered a mourner far past Shiva. And so if we're mourning, Rabbi Axler will get to this in a moment, but if we're mourning the loss of a parent, we're considered a mourner for an entire year. If we're mourning the loss of someone other than a parent, so maybe a sibling or a child, we're officially considered a mourner for 30 days. And even though we're officially considered a mourner for that long, it certainly doesn't mean we're finished mourning, but it means that some of the restrictions that are placed on us when we're mourners get lifted. So maybe the intensity of mourning is reduced, so we can sit in regular chairs again. We can leave the Shiva home. We can return to work, and we can wear makeup and jewelry. But some restrictions do remain in effect through the 30 days or through Shanah, the first year, which includes no shaving, no dinner parties, or listening to music, that our tradition really encourages us to make sure that we stay in a place of thoughtfulness and self-reflection and considering our souls and the loss that we've experienced. And then after 30 days, if we're official mourners for 30 days, then at 30 days, often the family will gather, sing some psalms, support one another, pray, and have a meal together to mark the transition. Again, these transitions, to mark a transition out of the official mourning space, and again, back into a less intense mourning phase. So, last thing for me, sometime between Shloshim and Shanah, the first year, we have a tradition of unveiling. which is when we set a permanent and conspicuous grave marker at the grave of our beloved. And this is not, there's no Jewish law that requires that we have an unveiling, but it is a custom that brings comfort to those who are mourning, those who have lost a loved one. And so this means that it's not required for clergy to be involved. So this can be a gathering at a grave marker of the family, an intimate gathering, and it can include clergy if that is so desired. But during this ceremony, it's a spiritual moment for the family to comfort each other, to share stories after a year, often a year has passed since the loss of a loved one, to reflect on their life, to reflect in a different headspace about how impactful their life has been on us and the things we've noticed about them and their impact over the course of a year of mourning. Often we'll sing psalms, say El Malei Rachamim, our memorial prayer, say our mourner's Kaddish, and sometimes even give another eulogy, a chesped. And then, of course, it's an unveiling, so we'll remove the veil to show the inscription on the gravestone. And the marker usually includes on a Jewish gravestone the English and Hebrew name of the deceased, the dates and death in English and Hebrew, the relationship to other family members, grandparents, parents, sister, brother, and then the letters Pei Nun, the Hebrew letters Pei Nun, which stand for Po Nichbar, which means here is buried. So if you walk around a Jewish cemetery, you'll see a lot of Pei Nuns, Pei Nuns, Pei Nuns. And I know in my life in the past, I've always been like, what is happening? Well, it is saying here is buried this person who we honor with this stone. And then we'll also see the Tav Nun Sadi Beit He, which is an abbreviation which stands for may their soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. So, there's no stipulation, according to Judaism, to the size of the marker, but we feel Judaism does profess this teaching that all are equal in death, and so that often serves as a guide. If you look through a Jewish cemetery, you'll often notice that we don't choose the most pretentious of markers, and it is often guided by this idea that we are all equal in death, and we honor equally all whose lives have ended, who have transitioned. Maybe I should take a moment to talk about stones, and then I'll pass the baton back to Rabbi Axler. So it's customary to leave stones on a grave marker, to place a stone to indicate that we have been there, that we have been present and visited. And some may say this is because stones last longer than flowers. So it's a more permanent way to mark our presence and our time with our beloved. But there's also an ancient biblical practice of piling stones on the grave of someone we love, and so it may also come from that tradition. But I wanted to close by bringing you a teaching that I really love from Rabbi Simcha Weintraub, who happens to be the rabbinic director of the New York Jewish Healing Center. And Rabbi Weintraub says that another interpretation is that the Hebrew word for pebble is tzror. And it happens that this Hebrew word also means bond in English. So when we pray the memorial prayer, El Malei Rachamim, we ask that the deceased be bound up in the bond of life, or in Hebrew, tzror hachayim. So by placing the stone on someone's grave marker, we show that we've been there, and that the individual's memory continues to live on, continues to be bound up in the world of the living through us as we move through the world. So with that, I'm going to pass the microphone back to Rabbi Axler, who will close us out.
Pebbles. That's my learning for today. Thank you. The interesting thing is, time itself is a construct, right? The very existence of minutes, hours, and days is a construct. And constructs are usually what we use to make sense of that which doesn't make sense, or that which makes us uncomfortable because it is precarious. So we don't know how many years we have, and so we can count our years, and maybe that helps us to be a little bit smarter, as it says, help us to number our days so that we could acquire a heart of meaning And so this notion that a year is somehow special, the idea that we celebrate birthdays, right? And I have just celebrated a milestone birthday, the idea that things are counted in decades and 50s and all of the things like that. But we use that construct of time to make sense and meaning out of our lives. And for this path of mourning, the idea of a year takes on great significance. By the way, for some, the idea is that a year short a little bit, so maybe 11 months. That's why the custom for some is an unveiling might come 11 months, so not quite at the full year. We've said Kaddish for 11 months, and my loved one was so good, they only needed 11 months of Kaddish to get to that special place that they're right in line for Olam Haba, right in line for the world to come. But the idea that we as mourners transition once again after 12 months, after that full year, and move from that place that we've gone through, that we mark that time as a way of perhaps returning into the fullness of life. For those who have withheld from something that was either pleasurable or maybe the tradition frowns upon shaving, going to major celebrations, listening to live music, all of those things. That first time when you move into the fullness of life again ought to be marked as a way of moving out of mourning, as a way of affirming the goodness of life and the idea that we'll be held accountable for all of the pleasures of this world that we passed upon, that God intended for us. And so moving from a year of mourning back into being, we would say maybe perhaps fully among the living. There are all kinds of ways of doing this. I would say that one of the things that is meaningful for me, and I think I've counseled others, we didn't talk about the Yizkor prayers, about the idea that our tradition dictates that on Yom Kippur and on the pilgrimage festivals, there are special memory prayers that we say on behalf of our loved ones. They're embedded into our liturgy, but we really traditionally don't say Yizkor prayers until we've moved out of that year. That those prayers become like a yahrzeit, like that year reminder, that those prayers become the way in which we say, time has indeed moved on. And perhaps I've stepped forward as well. The idea of lighting a memorial candle on the yahrzeit itself, whether you follow, and in my community this is always kind of a big toss-up, whether you follow by the English date of death, whether you follow by the Hebrew date of death, whether you can remember did they die sun up or sun down, whether you've written this down, whether one funeral home is sending you something that says the yahrzeit is this day, and your synagogue sends you something that says the yahrzeit is that day. The key is to mark and to remember. That idea of lighting a flame, of lighting a candle that lasts not like the flame that's lit traditionally upon returning from the cemetery, the flame that lasts through 7 days, that long, tall candle that lasts for 7 days, but rather a 24-hour flame. That every yahrzeit becomes a time to have maybe a day back together with our loved ones, to re-emphasize a piece of their memory, not just as we mark the first year since their loss, but every year thereafter, to light a flame and to take those 24 hours on that anniversary, on that yahrzeit, to maybe lift up something that was important to them, to commit yourself to doing something that they enjoyed, to eating their favorite food, to calling the person who you should have called during the last year to check in on, that bound you together with that person, and making a conscious effort to make holy that construct which is time. So, moving from a year of mourning, during which we may have observed any number of traditional or perhaps modern observances that mark us as an immediate mourner, to going back into the world and perhaps maybe recommitting ourselves to comforting the people who are now in their year of mourning, or their 30 days, or their Shiva. Just a little bit about those year points. From here, we are moving to, we are transitioning.
We are transitioning. That's a beautiful through line for the day. I really appreciate that through line. So we are moving now. We're going to move now into, we're going to use the word breakout rooms, but in real life. But before we do, I want to thank the folks on this stage and Rabbi Joseph who just walked out, but David Zinner, Rabbi Greenspan, and Rabbi Axler, thank you so much for bringing your wisdom.